I was standing on my back porch watching the smoke curl up from my fire pit when I saw Patricia Henderson marching across the field toward my property like she was leading a crusade. The sun was just starting to set over my 5 acres outside Springfield, Missouri, and I had been enjoying what I thought was a peaceful Friday evening after a long week of carpentry work. My name is Jefferson, and I had moved out here specifically to get away from people like Patricia. She was wearing her typical outfit, a beige pantsuit that looked like it cost more than my truck payment, and her hair was styled in that aggressive bob cut that screamed middle management. I knew who she was because she had left me 3 notes in my mailbox over the past month about various supposed violations of rules that did not apply to me. I lived 4.5 miles outside the city limits of Springfield, on a piece of land that my grandfather had left me. There was no HOA out here. There never had been. "Excuse me," Patricia called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. She stopped at the edge of my property line, which was marked by an old fence my grandfather had built in the 70s. "Are you aware that burning wood is strictly prohibited under HOA regulations?" I took a sip of my beer and looked at her calmly. "Madam, I'm not part of any HOA. I'm miles outside city limits." Her face flushed red, which happened so quickly I wondered if she had a blood pressure problem. "That's absurd. This entire area is under the jurisdiction of the Meadowbrook Hills Home Owners Association. I'm the president, and I'm telling you that you need to extinguish that fire immediately." I set my beer down on the porch railing and walked down the 3 wooden steps to my yard. "Listen, Patricia, I know you're the HOA president of that development about half a mile down the road, but I'm not in your development. This is private property that's been in my family for 40 years. You're creating a nuisance," she said, crossing her arms. "The smoke is drifting toward our neighborhood, and several residents have complained. Mrs. Chen has asthma, and Mr. Rodriguez just had his house repainted. Your reckless behavior is affecting property values." I had dealt with difficult clients before in my carpentry business, but something about Patricia's entitled attitude really got under my skin. "I'm burning wood on my own property, which is completely legal out here. There are no burning bans in effect, and I'm following all county regulations." "We'll see about that," Patricia said, pulling out her phone. "If you won't be reasonable, I'll have to call the authorities." "Go ahead," I said, picking up my beer again. "I've got nothing to hide." She stared at me for a long moment, clearly expecting me to back down. When I didn't, she jabbed at her phone screen with a perfectly manicured fingernail and turned slightly away, speaking in a loud voice that was obviously meant for me to hear. "Yes, hello. I need to report a code violation. A resident is burning wood in violation of local ordinances, and it's creating a health hazard for the neighborhood." She paused, listening. "The address is 14,750 County Road 425. Another pause. "Yes, I'll hold." I went back to my porch and sat down in my grandfather's old rocking chair. The fire crackled peacefully in the stone fire pit I had built myself last summer. I had used it dozens of times since then, usually on Friday nights like this, when I wanted to unwind and think about nothing in particular. Sometimes my friend Marcus would come over, and we would grill steaks and drink beer and talk about normal things like fishing and work, and whether the Cardinals had any chance at a playoff run. Patricia stayed at the property line, pacing back and forth while she talked to what I assumed was either the police department or code enforcement. The whole situation would have been funny if it was not so annoying. I had specifically moved out here to get away from the exact kind of petty nonsense that people like Patricia thrived on. About 20 minutes later, I saw the lights of a patrol car coming up my long gravel driveway. Patricia had moved to stand near where the driveway met the road, positioning herself like she was going to direct traffic or something. The deputy who got out of the car was someone I recognized from the hardware store in town. Young guy, maybe late 20s, with a professional demeanor. "Evening," he called out as he approached. "I'm Deputy Miller. Got a call about a possible code violation." "Yes, officer," Patricia jumped in before I could respond. "This man is burning wood in direct violation of HOA regulations. The smoke is affecting our entire neighborhood and creating a health hazard. As president of the Meadowbrook Hills HOA, I'm formally requesting that you cite him for this violation and force him to extinguish the fire immediately." Deputy Miller looked from Patricia to me, then walked over to where I was sitting on the porch. "Mr. Jefferson, right? I think I've seen you at Randall's Hardware." "That's right," I said, standing up. "I do carpentry work around the area. Pick up supplies there pretty regularly." "Mind if I ask what you're burning tonight?" "Just some oak and hickory," I said. "Leftover from a job I did last week. Figured it'd be nice to have a fire, maybe roast some hot dogs later." Deputy Miller nodded, then turned back to Patricia. "Madam, can you tell me the exact nature of the violation you're reporting?" Patricia launched into a detailed explanation of HOA rules regarding outdoor burning, nuisance smoke, and property value impacts. She had clearly memorized the relevant sections of her HOA bylaws and was reciting them like she was arguing a case before the Supreme Court. Deputy Miller listened politely, occasionally jotting something in his notepad. When she finally finished, Deputy Miller said, "Those are certainly comprehensive rules for your HOA. Can you tell me the boundaries of your HOA jurisdiction?" "Well, obviously it includes this property," Patricia said, gesturing toward my house. "We have authority over all residential properties in this area." "Actually, madam, I need to verify that." Deputy Miller pulled out his phone and tapped at the screen for a minute. "Mr. Jefferson, do you have your property deed handy?" "Sure, give me a second." I went inside and grabbed the folder I kept with all my important documents. The deed was right on top, along with the survey map that showed exactly where my property lines were. I brought it back out and handed it to Deputy Miller. He studied it carefully, then looked at his phone again. "Madam, according to the county records and this deed, Mr. Jefferson's property is located approximately 4.6 miles outside the Springfield city limits. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA covers a residential development on Maple Ridge Road, which is about half a mile east of here. Unless Mr. Jefferson voluntarily joined your HOA, which I'm guessing he didn't, he's not subject to your regulations." Patricia's face went through several interesting color changes. "That can't be right. You must be looking at the wrong records." "I'm looking at the official county GIS system," Deputy Miller said patiently. "It's pretty clear. This property isn't within your HOA boundaries." "But the smoke," Patricia sputtered. "It's affecting our residents. That has to be illegal." Deputy Miller walked over to the fire pit and examined it. "Mr. Jefferson, did you build this yourself?" "Yes, sir. Used fireproof stone, kept it 30 feet from any structures, and I only burn untreated wood. Checked all the county regulations before I built it." "It looks well constructed," Deputy Miller said. "And there's currently no burn ban in effect for this county. You're following all the relevant regulations that actually apply to this property." He turned back to Patricia. "Madam, what Mr. Jefferson is doing is completely legal. He has the right to have a fire on his own property as long as he's following safety guidelines, which he is." "This is ridiculous," Patricia said, her voice rising. "You're telling me he can just create a public nuisance and there's nothing anyone can do about it?" A small recreational fire on private property isn't a public nuisance under Missouri law, Deputy Miller explained. If the smoke was excessive, or if he was burning prohibited materials, that would be different. But from what I can see, everything here is above board. I felt a sense of vindication, but tried not to let it show too much on my face. Appreciate you coming out to verify that, Deputy. Just doing my job, he said. Mr. Jefferson, you're all set. Keep following the safety guidelines and you should have no problems. He nodded to me, then walked back toward Patricia. Madam, I understand your concerns about your community, but you need to make sure you're clear on where your HOA authority actually extends. Making false reports wastes police resources. False reports. Patricia's voice went up an octave. I made a legitimate complaint about a nuisance. A complaint about conduct that isn't illegal and doesn't fall under any jurisdiction you have authority over. Deputy Miller corrected her gently but firmly. I'm not going to cite you for anything tonight, but I'd suggest being more careful in the future about verifying facts before calling law enforcement. Patricia looked like she wanted to argue more, but Deputy Miller was already heading back to his patrol car. She stood there for a moment, staring at me with an expression that could have curdled milk, then turned on her heel and marched back toward the road. She had apparently walked over here, because I saw her stomping along the shoulder in the fading light until she disappeared from view. Deputy Miller paused before getting in his car and called out, "Have a good evening, Mr. Jefferson. Enjoy your fire." "You too, Deputy. Thanks again." After he left, I sat back down in the rocking chair and looked at my fire. It had burned down quite a bit during all the commotion, so I added a couple more logs and watched the flames leap up around them. The whole encounter had been absurd, but at least it was resolved quickly. I figured that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I woke up to find a certified letter taped to my front door. It was from the Meadowbrook Hills Home Owners Association, addressed to me as a delinquent resident. The letter informed me that I was in violation of multiple HOA regulations, including unauthorized outdoor burning, failure to maintain approved landscaping standards, and operating a business from a residential property without proper permits. It demanded that I cease all violations immediately and pay a fine of $1,500 within 30 days or face legal action. I read the letter 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rising with each pass. The claims were completely baseless. I was not a resident of their HOA. My landscaping was my own business on my own property, and while I did run my carpentry business from here, I was properly licensed and zoned for it under county regulations. This was pure harassment. I called my lawyer, a guy named Steve Martinez who had helped me with the business paperwork when I first started my carpentry company. I explained the situation to him and read him the letter. "That's interesting," Steve said. "Very interesting. Do you have the deed to your property handy?" "Yeah, I showed it to the deputy last night." "Good. Can you scan it and email it to me along with that letter from the HOA? I want to review everything and then we'll figure out our next steps." I did as he asked, using the scanner at my small home office where I handled the administrative side of my carpentry business. While I was at the computer, I decided to do some research on the Meadowbrook Hills HOA. A quick search brought up their website, which was surprisingly professional looking. They had been established 8 years ago when the development was built. There were currently 137 homes in the community, all subject to a thick book of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. I found Patricia Henderson listed as the current HOA board president. Her bio described her as a dedicated community advocate committed to preserving property values and maintaining the highest standards of neighborhood excellence. There was a photo of her smiling in front of a well-manicured lawn, looking nothing like the angry woman who had confronted me last night. The website also had a section for enforcement actions, which was essentially a public shaming list of residents who had violated HOA rules. I scrolled through it, reading about people who had been fined for having the wrong color mailbox, parking their car on the street overnight, or letting their grass grow a quarter-inch too long. It was a dystopian nightmare of petty rule enforcement. Steve called me back about an hour later. "Okay, I've reviewed everything. This is pretty cut and dry. You're not part of their HOA, period. Your property was never included in their development, you never signed their covenants, and you're geographically outside their jurisdiction. This letter they sent you is completely without merit." So what do I do? I'm going to draft a response explaining very clearly that you're not subject to their authority and that any further harassment will result in legal action on your part. I'll cite the relevant property records and Missouri law regarding HOA jurisdiction. That should be enough to make them back off. And if it's not, then we file for a restraining order and possibly sue them for harassment. But let's start with the letter and see if that resolves it. Most HOAs will back down once they realize they have no legal leg to stand on. How much is this going to cost me? For the letter, $250. If we have to take further action, we'll discuss fees at that point. But honestly, Wade, I think this will be the end of it. No one wants to go to court over something this obviously frivolous. I agreed to let him send the letter and tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. I had work to do anyway. I was in the middle of building custom cabinets for a client in Republic, and I needed to finish the door frames by Monday. I spent the rest of Saturday in my workshop, which was a large pole barn I had built behind my house specifically for the carpentry business. Sunday morning, I was sitting on my porch drinking coffee when I noticed a car driving slowly past my property. It was a silver Lexus, and I could see Patricia Henderson in the driver's seat. She was holding up her phone like she was taking pictures or video. She made 2 passes, both times slowing down to a crawl in front of my driveway before finally driving away. I called Steve and told him what happened. "Document it," he advised. "Take photos if she comes back. We're building a harassment case if we need it. My letter should be delivered to their HOA office by Tuesday, so hopefully this will stop." But it did not stop. On Monday evening, I came home from delivering the cabinets to my client to find that someone had called the county health department. There was a notice on my door stating that a complaint had been filed regarding illegal dumping and improper waste disposal on my property. An inspector would be coming by on Wednesday to investigate. I knew exactly who had filed that complaint. I walked around my property looking for anything that could possibly be construed as illegal dumping. The only thing I could find was a small pile of scrap wood behind my workshop, which I had been planning to burn in my fire pit over the next few weeks. It was neatly stacked and covered with a tarp. Hardly illegal dumping. On Tuesday, I got a call from the Missouri Department of Revenue. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint suggesting that I was running an unlicensed business and evading taxes. The woman on the phone was apologetic, but explained that they were required to investigate all complaints. She asked me to fax over my business license, tax returns for the past 3 years, and various other documents. I spent 2 hours gathering paperwork and faxing it to them from the library in town. That evening, Steve called me. "Wade, I heard back from the HOA." "Well, actually, I heard from their lawyer. They're refusing to acknowledge that you're outside their jurisdiction. They're claiming that your property is in a zone of impact that gives them authority to regulate activities that affect their residents." Zone of impact. What the hell is that? It's a theory they apparently just made up. It has no basis in Missouri law. Their lawyer is a guy named Kenneth Prescott. I know him, actually. He usually handles real estate transactions, not HOA enforcement. I don't think he really understands what he's gotten himself into here. So what now? Now, I send him a much firmer letter explaining that if they don't cease and desist immediately, we'll be filing a lawsuit for harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I'll also mention that we're aware of the false complaints being filed with various government agencies, and that those could constitute criminal misconduct. Criminal. Filing false reports with government agencies can be a crime, yes. I doubt it would actually lead to charges in this case, but it's worth mentioning to show we're serious. The health inspector showed up Wednesday morning. He was a tired-looking man in his 50s named Bob Chen. I walked him around the property, showing him that there was no illegal dumping, no improper waste disposal, and no environmental hazards of any kind. I had a feeling this was bogus when I saw the complaint, Bob said, filling out his report. We get a lot of harassment complaints from HOA disputes. People use us as a weapon against their neighbors. It's frustrating because it wastes our time and taxpayer resources. Can I ask who filed the complaint? It was anonymous, but it came from an email address associated with the Meadowbrook Hills HOA website. That's about all I can tell you. He handed me a copy of his report, which stated that no violations were found. You're all clear, Mr. Jefferson. Sorry you had to deal with this. After he left, I called Steve and told him about the inspector's findings and the fact that the complaint had come from someone associated with the HOA. Perfect, Steve said. That's more documentation. I'm going to include this in my letter to their lawyer. Wade, I think we need to consider going on the offensive here. These people aren't going to stop with polite letters. They're escalating. What do you suggest? Let me make some calls and see what our options are. In the meantime, keep documenting everything. Every interaction, every complaint, every time you see her driving past your property. We're going to need it. That weekend, I decided to have a small gathering at my place. I invited Marcus, my friend from high school who worked as a mechanic in town, and a couple other buddies I played poker with occasionally. We grilled burgers, drank beer, and had a fire in the fire pit. It was exactly the kind of peaceful evening I had moved out here to enjoy. Around 8 o'clock, a Springfield police cruiser came up my driveway. This time it was not Deputy Miller but an older officer I did not recognize. He got out and approached us with a weary expression. "Evening, gentlemen. I'm Sergeant Davis. We got a noise complaint about this address." Marcus laughed. "Noise complaint? We're just talking. We're not even playing music." "I understand, and I'm sorry to bother you. The complaint said there was a large party with loud music and excessive noise disturbing the peace." Sergeant Davis looked around at the four of us sitting quietly around a fire. "This is clearly not what was described. Can I ask, have you had any disputes with neighbors recently?" "Not neighbors exactly," I said. "But there's an HOA president from a development about half a mile away who's been harassing me. I think she's the one making false complaints." "Patricia Henderson," I was surprised. "Yeah, how'd you know?" Sergeant Davis sighed. "Because this is the third bogus call we've gotten from that area this week, and her name keeps coming up. Between you and me, we're getting tired of it. Filing false police reports is a crime, but it's hard to prove unless we can definitively show that the person knew the report was false when they made it." "She knows," I said. "She was here last Friday when Deputy Miller confirmed I'm outside city limits and not subject to her HOA rules. Everything since then has been retaliation. Do you have documentation of all this? My lawyer does. We're building a harassment case. Good. Keep doing that. And if she contacts you directly, don't engage. Just document it and report it to your lawyer. These HOA disputes can get ugly if they're not handled properly. Sergeant Davis handed me his card. If you have any more problems, call me directly. Reference case number 2025-4471. I'm going to make a note in our system about the harassment pattern so if she calls again, we'll know to take it with a grain of salt. After Sergeant Davis left, Marcus shook his head. Man, what did you do to piss this lady off so bad? I had a fire on my own property, I said. That's literally it. She tried to tell me it violated HOA rules. I explained I'm not in her HOA, and she's been making my life hell ever since. Some people have too much time on their hands, one of my other friends, Dave, said. My sister lives in an HOA in Florida. They tried to fine her for having the wrong shade of white on her front door. She had to go to 3 meetings with paint samples to prove it was the approved color. It was insane. We spent the rest of the evening swapping HOA horror stories that everyone had heard from friends or family members. I went to bed that night feeling frustrated that something so simple had turned into such a complicated mess. Monday morning I was in my workshop when Steve called. Wade, I've got good news and bad news. Which do you want first? Bad news. The HOA has filed a lawsuit against you. They're seeking an injunction to stop you from burning wood on your property, claiming it constitutes a nuisance that affects their members' health and property values. They're also demanding $1,500 in fines plus their legal fees. I felt my stomach drop. You said there was good news. The good news is that their lawsuit is complete garbage and will almost certainly be dismissed. Plus, by filing it, they've given us the perfect opportunity to countersue. We can ask for our legal fees, damages for harassment, and possibly even get an injunction against them to stop all this nonsense. How much is this going to cost me? Hard to say. If we can get their suit dismissed quickly, maybe a couple thousand. If it drags on, could be more. But Wade, here's the thing. If we win, and I'm confident we will, we can potentially recover all our fees from them. And more importantly, we can put a stop to this permanently. When do we have to respond? We've got 30 days from the date you're served. Have you been served yet? Not that I know of. You will be soon. In the meantime, I'm going to start preparing our response and our counterclaim. This is actually a good development, believe it or not. It's going to give a judge the opportunity to shut this down once and for all. 2 days later, I was served with the lawsuit papers. A process server showed up at my workshop and handed me a thick envelope. I sat in my truck and read through it, feeling increasingly angry with each page. The lawsuit was filled with exaggerations and outright lies. It claimed that I operated a commercial industrial facility on my property that generated toxic smoke, affecting the health and safety of dozens of families. It said that my activities had caused property values in Meadowbrook Hills to decline by an estimated tens of thousands of dollars per home. It was absurd. I had a small carpentry workshop where I built custom furniture and cabinets. The only smoke I generated was from my recreational fire pit, which I used maybe once or twice a week. I had never burned anything toxic, never operated any industrial equipment, and certainly had not caused anyone's property value to decline. I forwarded everything to Steve and tried to focus on my work. I had a big project coming up, building a custom entertainment center for a client in Nixa, and I needed the money. But it was hard to concentrate knowing that this frivolous lawsuit was hanging over my head. Steve called me the next day. I've reviewed their complaint. It's even worse than I thought, which is actually good for us. They've made specific factual claims that are demonstrably false. That's going to help us with our defamation counterclaim. Can we really win money from them? Potentially, yes. We can seek damages for the harm they've caused you, which includes your legal fees, your time dealing with all this, emotional distress, and possibly even lost business if you can show that their actions have interfered with your work. Plus, we can ask for punitive damages if we can show that their conduct was particularly egregious. How do we prove that? We document everything, just like we've been doing. We show the pattern of harassment, the false complaints to government agencies, the bogus police calls, and now this frivolous lawsuit. We paint a picture of a vindictive HOA president who's abusing her position to harass someone who's not even in her HOA. Over the next few weeks, I focused on work and tried to maintain my normal routine. I kept having fires in my fire pit, partly because I enjoyed them and partly because I refused to let Patricia intimidate me into changing my behavior when I was doing nothing wrong. Each time I had a fire, I took photos documenting that it was a small, controlled recreational fire following all safety guidelines. Patricia drove past my property several more times. I started taking photos of her car each time I saw it. Once, she actually stopped and took video of my workshop while I was loading lumber into my truck. I took video of her taking video of me, which seemed ridiculous, but Steve said it was good documentation. The health department came back out after another anonymous complaint, this time claiming that I was improperly storing hazardous materials. Again, the inspector found nothing and was visibly annoyed at having his time wasted. He told me that if they got another bogus complaint from this situation, he was going to recommend that the county attorney look into filing charges against whoever kept making the false reports. The Missouri Department of Revenue called again with more questions about my business, based on another anonymous complaint claiming I was operating a cash-only business to evade taxes. I patiently explained that I accepted checks and credit cards, kept detailed records, and filed quarterly estimated tax payments. The agent seemed satisfied but said the complaint would remain on file. Through all of this, Steve was preparing our response to the HOA's lawsuit and our counterclaim. He sent me drafts to review, and I was impressed by how thoroughly he had documented everything. He had statements from Deputy Miller and Sergeant Davis about the false reports. He had the health inspector's reports showing no violations. He had the deed and survey clearly showing my property was outside HOA boundaries. He even had photos from the county GIS system showing the precise locations of my property versus the Meadowbrook Hills development. Our counterclaim sought $25,000 in damages for harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It also asked for an injunction prohibiting the HOA from contacting me or making any further complaints about my property, and it demanded that they pay all our legal fees. Are we really going to get $25,000? I asked Steve. Probably not the full amount, he admitted. But I want to start high. These things usually settle for less than what you ask for. Plus, I want them to understand that there are real consequences for this kind of behavior. The court date for the first hearing was set for early March. Steve explained that this would just be a preliminary hearing where the judge would consider their motion for an injunction and our motion to dismiss their complaint. The real trial, if it got that far, would be months later. In the meantime, I had to deal with more harassment. Someone filed a complaint with the county saying that I was running an unlicensed daycare out of my home. That one was particularly bizarre since I had no children and had never provided any kind of childcare service. The county investigator who came out seemed embarrassed to even be there. "Mr. Jefferson, I'm required to investigate every complaint we receive, but I have to say, this one seems particularly unlikely given your circumstances. It's part of an ongoing harassment campaign by an HOA president," I explained. "My lawyer has documentation if you need it." The investigator wrote up his report finding no evidence of unlicensed daycare operations and left. Before he got in his car, he turned back and said, "For what it's worth, I'm going to recommend to my supervisor that we flag this address in our system. If we get any more obviously false complaints, we may pursue charges against whoever is filing them." "I appreciate that," I said. "I really did." It was frustrating that all these government agencies had to waste time investigating false complaints, but at least most of the investigators seemed to recognize what was happening and were sympathetic. A few days before the court hearing, something unexpected happened. I was working in my shop when I heard a vehicle coming up the driveway. I looked out to see an unfamiliar SUV. A woman in her 60s got out looking nervous. "Mr. Jefferson, my name is Linda Chen. I live in Meadowbrook Hills." I walked out to meet her, curious. "What can I do for you?" "I wanted to apologize," she said. "Patricia Henderson has been telling everyone in the HOA that you're some kind of industrial polluter who's deliberately trying to harm our neighborhood. She's been organizing people to file complaints and showing up at board meetings with photos and videos of your property. I believed her at first, but then my son looked up your address and explained that you're miles away from us and not even in our HOA. I appreciate you coming to tell me that." "There's more," Linda continued. "A group of us have been doing some research on Patricia's tenure as HOA president. We've discovered that she's been very aggressive about enforcement, to the point where she's cost the HOA thousands of dollars in legal fees fighting petty battles with residents. Some people are talking about trying to remove her from the board. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know that not everyone in Meadowbrook Hills supports what she's doing to you. Some of us think she's gone way too far, and also—" She paused, looking uncomfortable. "I'm the Mrs. Chen that Patricia mentioned when she confronted you about the smoke, the one with asthma. I want you to know that your fires have never bothered me. I've never even smelled smoke from your property. Patricia lied about that to try to add weight to her complaints." I was stunned. "Would you be willing to put that in writing? If it would help, yes. I think what she's doing is wrong. My son is actually a lawyer, and he said that if Patricia is making false statements in legal filings, that could be a serious problem for her." I called Steve immediately and explained what had happened. He was excited about this development and asked to speak with Linda. They talked for about 15 minutes while I waited anxiously. When Linda handed the phone back to me, she looked determined. "Your lawyer is going to send me a declaration to sign. I'm going to state that Patricia falsely claimed I was affected by your fires and that she's been misrepresenting facts to the HOA membership. I hope it helps your case." "Thank you so much," I said. "You didn't have to come here." "Yes, I did," Linda said. "I've watched Patricia bully too many people in our neighborhood. It's time someone stood up to her." After Linda left, Steve explained how significant her testimony could be. "If we can show that Patricia knowingly made false statements in the lawsuit, that goes to the heart of their case. It also strengthens our defamation claim. This could be the smoking gun we need to not just get their case dismissed, but to actually win significant damages." The day of the hearing arrived. I took off work and met Steve at the Greene County Courthouse in downtown Springfield. It was a cold March morning, and I was nervous despite Steve's confidence. I had never been involved in a lawsuit before. Patricia was there with her lawyer, Kenneth Prescott. She was dressed in a navy blue suit, and looked like she was attending a business meeting rather than a court hearing. She glared at me when I walked in but did not say anything. The hearing was in front of Judge Margaret Walsh, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who had a reputation for not tolerating frivolous litigation. Steve had said this was good for us. Patricia's lawyer spoke first, arguing that my wood burning created a nuisance that affected his client's health and property values, and that the court should issue an injunction stopping me from burning anything on my property. He claimed that HOA regulations were designed to protect property values and quality of life, and that my activities were undermining those goals. Judge Walsh listened patiently, then asked, "Mr. Prescott, where exactly is Mr. Jefferson's property located relative to your HOA boundaries?" Prescott seemed to have been hoping she would not ask that. "Well, Your Honor, the property is technically outside the formal HOA boundaries, but it's in what we call a zone of impact." A zone of impact, is that a legally recognized concept in Missouri? It's a reasonable extension of nuisance law, Your Honor. Just because someone is outside formal boundaries doesn't mean they have the right to create a nuisance affecting nearby properties. But Missouri nuisance law requires that the alleged nuisance be substantial and unreasonable, Judge Walsh said. Is having a small recreational fire on one's own property outside city limits substantial and unreasonable? When it affects the health of nearby residents, yes, Your Honor. And you have evidence of these health effects. We have a statement from Mrs. Chen, who has asthma and has been affected by the smoke. Judge Walsh made a note. I want to see that statement. Mr. Martinez, your turn. Steve stood up and delivered a devastating presentation. He showed the property records proving I was miles outside any HOA jurisdiction. He presented photos of my fire pit showing it was a small, controlled recreational fire. He showed the health department reports finding no violations. He showed the statements from the police officers about the false complaints. And then he presented Linda Chen's declaration. Your Honor, Mrs. Chen states here, under penalty of perjury, that she has never been affected by Mr. Jefferson's fires and that Miss Henderson falsely claimed otherwise. This goes to the heart of the plaintiff's case. They have filed this lawsuit based on false premises, wasted this court's time, and caused my client significant distress and expense. Patricia's face went red. Her lawyer was frantically whispering to her while Steve continued. Furthermore, Your Honor, we have documented a pattern of harassment by Miss Henderson against my client. False complaints to multiple government agencies, false police reports, and now this frivolous lawsuit. We are asking the court to not only dismiss the plaintiff's complaint, but to award sanctions against them for bringing such a baseless case. Judge Walsh looked at Patricia. Miss Henderson, did you tell your lawyer that Mrs. Chen was affected by Mr. Jefferson's fires? Patricia stood up, looking flustered. Your Honor, I believed at the time that she was affected. There was smoke and she has asthma, so I assumed. You assumed, Judge Walsh interrupted. Did you actually speak with Mrs. Chen to verify that she was having problems? Well, not directly, but so you made a factual claim in a legal filing without actually verifying it was true. Patricia's lawyer stood up. Your Honor, if I may, this appears to be a misunderstanding. My client may have been mistaken about certain facts, but that doesn't mean this case is frivolous. Actually, Mr. Prescott, that's exactly what it means, Judge Walsh said. This court does not have time for cases based on assumptions and unverified claims. Mr. Jefferson is clearly outside your HOA jurisdiction. He is engaging in legal activity on his own property. Your client has presented no credible evidence of any substantial nuisance. This case is dismissed. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. but Judge Walsh was not done. Furthermore, I am issuing a preliminary injunction prohibiting Miss Henderson and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA from contacting Mr. Jefferson or filing any complaints regarding his property unless they have clear, verifiable evidence of an actual legal violation. If you violate this order, you may be held in contempt of court. She turned to Steve. Mr. Martinez, I'm granting your motion to dismiss the plaintiff's complaint. As for your counterclaim, that will need to be heard at a later date. However, I am awarding you sanctions in the amount of $5,000 for having to defend against this frivolous lawsuit. The plaintiff will have 30 days to pay. Patricia looked like she was going to be sick. Her lawyer was packing up his briefcase with shaking hands. Steve was smiling. As we walked out of the courtroom, I heard Prescott saying to Patricia, I told you we should have verified those facts before filing. Now the HOA is going to be on the hook for $5,000 plus my fees. Patricia's response was too quiet to hear, but she looked furious. Outside the courthouse, Steve shook my hand. That went about as well as it possibly could have. Judge Walsh was not happy about having her time wasted. The $5,000 in sanctions is good, but we still have our counterclaim to pursue. That's where we'll potentially get more significant damages. Do you think they'll settle now? I'd be surprised if they didn't. Patricia's position on the HOA board is probably in jeopardy after this. Linda Chen mentioned that people were already talking about removing her. Having the HOA be on the hook for $5,000 in sanctions, plus potentially a lot more in damages, is going to make her very unpopular with the other residents. Steve was right. 2 weeks later, Kenneth Prescott called Steve to discuss a settlement. They wanted to settle our counterclaim to avoid going to trial. Steve negotiated hard, and we eventually agreed on a settlement of $18,000, plus a written agreement that the HOA would not contact me or make any complaints about my property in the future, unless there was a verified legal violation. The agreement also required Patricia to send me a written apology. The apology letter arrived a week after we signed the settlement. It was clearly written by a lawyer and was very formal, but it did acknowledge that Patricia had been mistaken about my property being in the HOA jurisdiction, and that she regretted the inconvenience caused to me. It was not exactly heartfelt, but it was something. A few weeks after that, Linda Chen stopped by my property again. She had good news. Patricia resigned from the HOA board, Linda told me. After the lawsuit and the settlement came out, a lot of residents were angry about how much money she had cost the HOA. There was a special meeting where people called for her resignation. She tried to defend herself, but eventually she stepped down. Who's going to replace her? Actually, I'm going to run for president. A few of us have decided it's time to take the HOA in a different direction. Less focus on petty enforcement and more focus on actually building a community. We're going to propose some changes to the bylaws to prevent this kind of abuse of power in the future. That sounds like a good change. It is. And Mr. Jefferson, on behalf of the HOA, I want to apologize again for what Patricia put you through. She was supposed to be looking out for our community's interests, but instead she was on a personal vendetta. That's not what an HOA should be about. I appreciated Linda's words. She seemed like the kind of person who would actually make the HOA functional and reasonable rather than a tool for harassment. Life gradually returned to normal after that. I continued my carpentry work, had fires in my fire pit whenever I wanted, and enjoyed the peace and quiet of living on my own land outside city limits. The $18,000 settlement, after Steve's fees were deducted, left me with about $12,000. I used some of it to upgrade my workshop equipment and put the rest in savings. I never saw Patricia again after the court hearing. I heard through Linda that she and her husband had put their house in Meadowbrook Hills up for sale and were moving to a different state. I felt a little bad that things had escalated to that point, but I also felt like there was a certain amount of justice in it. She had tried to use her HOA position to bully someone who was not even in her HOA, and it had backfired spectacularly. The whole experience taught me a few things. First, that property rights and jurisdictional boundaries actually matter, even when someone with a little bit of authority tries to tell you otherwise. Second, that documentation is crucial when you're dealing with any kind of dispute. If I had not kept records of every interaction, every false complaint, and every instance of harassment, our case would have been much weaker. And third, that there are still reasonable people out there who will stand up against bullies when they see injustice happening. Marcus came over one Friday evening a few months after everything was settled. We grilled steaks and had a fire in the fire pit, just like we had done dozens of times before. The smoke curled up into the clear Missouri night sky, and we talked about fishing and work and the Cardinals' chances for the season. "You know," Marcus said, "I still can't believe that whole thing with the HOA. It's crazy that someone with no authority over you tried so hard to control what you do on your own land. Some people just can't stand not being in control," I said. Patricia probably ran her HOA like her own little kingdom, and she couldn't handle the fact that my property was outside her domain. She took it as a personal insult. Well, she sure paid for it. $18,000 is not cheap. "Actually, the HOA's insurance probably covered most of it," I said. "But she still lost her position and her reputation in the community. That probably hurt her more than the money." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire. A cool breeze was blowing across the fields, carrying the smoke away from any houses or neighbors. It was peaceful and quiet, exactly the way I liked it. "You ever think about what would have happened if you had just given in at the beginning?" Marcus asked. "If you had just stopped having fires when she first complained?" I thought about that. Honestly, if she had approached me reasonably and just asked me to be mindful of when I had fires, I probably would have worked with her. I'm not trying to bother anyone. But she came at me with demands and threats, claiming authority she did not have. Once someone does that, you kind of have to stand your ground or they'll just keep pushing. True. And now you've got a nice chunk of change and the legal right to do whatever you want on your property. Within reason, I corrected. I still have to follow county regulations and state law, I just don't have to follow HOA rules that don't apply to me. Still, it's a good outcome. Justice prevailed and all that. I raised my beer. I'll drink to that. We clinked bottles and went back to watching the fire. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a dog barking and the faint sound of traffic on the county road. But up here on my 5 acres, surrounded by trees and fields, it felt like I was a million miles from anywhere. That was exactly why I had chosen to live out here, away from the city and away from the kind of petty nonsense that people like Patricia thrived on. I had my workshop, my business, my land, and my freedom to live my life as I saw fit within the law. No HOA, no covenants, no restrictions beyond the reasonable regulations that applied to everyone. A few months later, I ran into Deputy Miller at the hardware store. He recognized me and came over to say hello. "Mr. Jefferson, good to see you." I heard about how that whole situation with the HOA turned out. Judge Walsh really laid into them from what I understand. "She did," I confirmed. "Everything's settled now. No more harassment." "That's good to hear." Between you and me, we were getting pretty tired of responding to those bogus calls. It's frustrating when people use law enforcement as a tool for personal disputes. I can imagine. I appreciate you and Sergeant Davis being professional about it and actually checking the facts. Just doing our job, Deputy Miller said. But I'm glad it worked out for you. Some people think that having a little bit of authority means they can push everyone around. It's nice when the system works and puts a stop to that. He was right. The system had worked, albeit slowly and with significant stress and expense on my part. But in the end, the law had been clear. I was outside HOA jurisdiction. I was following all applicable regulations, and Patricia had no right to harass me or make false complaints. I heard from Linda Chen occasionally after that. She had been elected HOA president and was working on reforming the organization. They had changed the bylaws to require board approval before filing any lawsuits or making complaints to government agencies. They had also implemented a mediation process for disputes with residents before jumping to fines and enforcement actions. We're trying to make the HOA what it was supposed to be in the first place, Linda told me during one of her updates. A way to maintain common areas and handle community issues, not a way for one person to impose their will on everyone else. It sounded like a much healthier approach. I told her I was glad to hear it and wished her luck. As time went on, the whole incident became just another story in my life. The kind of thing I would tell people about when the topic of HOAs came up, usually followed by head shaking and comments about how crazy some HOA boards could be. I had learned to laugh about it eventually, though at the time it had been stressful and infuriating. The settlement money helped me expand my carpentry business. I was able to buy a better table saw and a planer, which allowed me to take on more complex projects. Work was good, and I was building a solid reputation in the area for quality craftsmanship. Clients would come out to my workshop to discuss projects, and I never had any problems with them being confused about whether I was properly zoned and licensed. Everything was legitimate and above board. I kept having fires in my fire pit every week or two, whenever the weather was nice and I felt like it. I never worried about someone calling the police or filing complaints anymore. The injunction from Judge Walsh and the settlement agreement gave me legal protection, and Patricia was gone from the area entirely. One evening about a year after the whole ordeal ended, I was sitting by my fire when I saw a car coming up the driveway. For a brief moment, I felt that old tension, wondering if it was going to be another confrontation. But it was just Dave, one of my poker buddies, stopping by to drop off some lumber he had gotten for free and thought I might be able to use. "Sorry to just show up," Dave said. "I was driving by and saw your fire. Thought I'd stop in." "No problem at all. Want a beer?" "Sure." We sat by the fire and talked about nothing in particular. Dave's lumber was good quality oak that would be perfect for a project I had coming up, and I was grateful for it. We watched the smoke drift up into the darkening sky, and I felt completely at peace. This was what I had wanted when I moved out here. The freedom to live on my own land, run my business, and enjoy simple pleasures like a fire on a cool evening without someone trying to control every aspect of what I did. The fight with Patricia and the HOA had been unpleasant, but in a way, it had validated my choice to live out here. The law had confirmed that I was indeed outside their jurisdiction and outside their control. I thought about all the people living in HOA communities, dealing with rules about what color they could paint their mailbox or whether they could park their own car in their own driveway. I understood that HOAs served a purpose for some people, that they wanted that level of community organization and uniformity. But it was not for me, and I was grateful every day that my grandfather had bought this land long before any developments came to the area. The fire burned low and Dave eventually headed home. I sat there for a while longer, finishing my beer and thinking about how the situation had played out. In the end, truth and facts had won over false claims and harassment. The legal system, despite its flaws and slowness, had worked. And I had been vindicated in my simple desire to live my life without unreasonable interference. I poured some water on the fire to make sure it was completely out, then headed inside. Tomorrow, I had to finish a set of bookshelves for a client in Ozark, and I wanted to get an early start. Life was back to normal, and that was exactly what I wanted. The whole experience had reminded me why I valued independence and property rights so much. In America, you are supposed to be able to own your land and live your life as you see fit, as long as you are not harming others or breaking the law. Patricia had tried to extend her authority beyond its legitimate boundaries, and the system had corrected that overreach. I never wished her ill, despite everything she had put me through. I hoped that wherever she ended up, she would learn from the experience and not try to control people who were not under her authority. But that was not my concern anymore. My concern was my work, my land, and living the quiet life I had chosen. As I got ready for bed that night, I looked out the window at the dark silhouette of my workshop against the night sky. This was my place, my domain, my freedom. And no HOA, no matter how aggressive or determined, was going to take that away from me. The law had confirmed it, Judge Walsh had validated it, and the $18,000 settlement had punctuated it. I slept well that night, as I did most nights now that the harassment had stopped. The next morning I woke up early, made coffee, and went out to my workshop to start on those bookshelves. The sun was rising over the fields, birds were singing in the trees, and smoke from someone's chimney a mile or so away was drifting peacefully across the landscape. It was a good life, and I was grateful for it. The fight with Patricia and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA had been an unwelcome disruption, but it had ended the right way. Justice had been served, boundaries had been established, and I could go back to living my life in peace. That, in the end, was all I had ever wanted. Just to be left alone to live on my own land, outside the city limits, outside any HOA jurisdiction, and outside anyone's control but the reasonable laws that applied to everyone. Patricia had learned the hard way that you cannot simply extend your authority wherever you want it to reach, and that making false claims and harassing people has consequences. I finished the bookshelves that week and delivered them to my client. She was thrilled with the work and immediately asked if I could build a matching entertainment center for her living room. Word of mouth was spreading about my craftsmanship, and I was staying busy with projects. The carpentry business was thriving, all properly licensed and zoned, all completely legal. Life continued on peacefully. I never heard from Patricia again. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA, under Linda's leadership, became a reasonable organization that focused on maintaining common areas and fostering community, rather than harassing residents over trivial matters. And I continued to live on my 5 acres outside Springfield, having fires in my fire pit whenever I wanted, secure in the knowledge that I was miles outside city limits and beyond any HOA jurisdiction. It was a simple victory, but an important one. The right to use your own property as you see fit, within the bounds of reasonable law, is fundamental. And when someone tries to take that right away through false claims and harassment, it is worth fighting back. I was glad I had fought, glad I had documented everything, and glad that the system had ultimately worked in favor of truth and justice. That is how my story with the HOA ended. Not with dramatic confrontations or ongoing battles, but with a quiet return to normal life. Sometimes the best ending is just being able to go back to the peaceful existence you had before someone tried to disrupt it. And that, finally, was exactly what I had.